So yeah, we all seem to have an opinion. In fact, the people that know the least about the womb seem to have the most vocal and adamant opinions about it. But I thought it was high time that we dug a little bit deeper into what this organ does and can do for us.
So let's do the basics. How about, shape, actual location, things like that. Tell us is really the science of the thing.
It's funny to me that my book is categorized in some bookshops as a scientist at all, but maybe that's my own kind of embedded ideas about what is and isn't science, because women's health, gynecology, and reproduction are actually really science. So the womb is just the word that we use colloquially for uterus, and it is roughly the kind of size of an upside down pear, or shape of an upside down pear, and roughly kind of fist sized, and it sits nestled within the brim of the pelvis. We've got the bony cage of the pelvis. Sorry, I should be speaking into my phone. The bony cage of the pelvis, and it's kind of tucked down within the pelvis in its non-pregnant state. And then, of course, when there is an ongoing pregnancy, the uterus can expand to many times its size. It's got this very strong, robust kind of bast the fetus, and this brand new organ that it magically makes, the placenta, and all the amniotic fluid that cushions the fetus as well. And then, amazingly, shrinks back down, tucks itself away again. So there's no. But as the womb is so much more than just an empty vessel for gestation.
Well, that's it, because we do think of it in terms of reproduction, whether we want to reproduce or not want to reproduce. And yet, what you say is the non-pregnant uterus is not a dormant thing. It is always doing things. There are microorganisms going on all the time. So what is it doing all the time besides growing a lining and shedding a lining and growing a lining and shedding? What actually is happening in it?
Yeah, well, this was kind of mind-blowing to me. I mean, obviously, when I set out to write the book, I had to position myself as somebody who knew quite a lot about the womb and was qualified to write a book about it. And I thought that there wouldn't be that many surprises for me along the way. But as I started researching it, I came across this whole new field of science that I was completely unaware of, which has the potential to revolutionize the way we look at gynecology and sexual health. And that is the science of the uterine microbiome. So a lot of us are familiar with the term microbiome when we think about our gut. We know that our gut is colonized by billions of microscopic organisms, including bacteria, the good and the bad, viruses, fungi, sometimes other little organisms, and they generally exist in a sort of peaceful balance. And sometimes when that microbiome can become unbalanced, it can really have a drastic effect on our disease state. And a lot of us wouldn't really associate the uterus with that concept of a microbiome, because we grow up thinking, well, when are we hanging out? And that's not the case. Was this paradigm called the sterile womb paradigm that existed until only about 20 years. We all really were raised in, which is around waiting for sperm, completely sealed and sterile, and there is no life within an egg and creates a baby. But that's actually not the case. As scientific techniques have become more sophisticated and refined over the last, I would say, kind of quarter century, and we can look at little fragments of tissue and analyze their material and the sort of microscopic life forms that exist there, we know now that the uterus actually has its own microbiome. And it's completely separate from the gut microbiome or even the vaginal microbiome. It has its own with a rich have discovered that the uterine microbiome actually seems to have some with endometrial cancer, endometriosis and other kind of gynae disease states. So if we can better understand the uterus in its kind of resting state and all the life that exists within it, then we might be a bit closer to understanding all these diseases that have challenged us for so long.
Is this related? You talk a lot in the book about how menstrual blood is a really precious source of information. This is related to that, isn't it?
It is a bit, and this is the thing I would say that probably surprised me most when I was researching the book, because when we think about menstrual blood, we've all been raised to think of it as just kind of gross, right? It's just yucky, it's useless. Even if you're kind of period positive, you probably don't really think about what that tissue can tell you or do for you. We flush it, we bin it, we put it away. But each person menstrual blood, because it's more than just blood. It's endometrial cells and immune cells and other bits that I go into in the book. Each person's menstrual tissue has its own physiological fingerprint. So that menstrual tissue that you shed each month or whenever, if you do have a period, is unique to you. And at that moment can tell you just as much, in fact, probably a lot more about your gynae health than if you were to take a blood sample, for example, from your arm, which is probably what your doctor would be more likely to do if you initially went along with a problem. So, for example, there's a doctor I spoke to in America called Dr. Christine Metz, who's running this fantastic where she has recruited people with cups or pads into her lab. And when she analyzes the cells in each person's tissue, she finds a really high diagnostic correlation with endometriosis. Now, this is mind-blowing because most people with endometriosis have about a 7 to 10 year wait for actual diagnosis because, well, for a number of reasons, mainly the that. A 10-year wait, this person who might be experiencing debilitating pain and fatigue, nausea, other symptoms, has probably distressing, time-consuming, expensive investigations like hysteroscopy and laparoscopy and all these other kinds of things. So imagine if we get to a stage where you can literally just have a period, send in your pad, have that analyzed, and the doctor goes, oh, well, looks like you have endometriosis. Totally for so many of us. It's not only possible, you could do similar analyses for other diseases, which would completely revolutionize, the lives of people who are coping with these things. And that just spun my head completely.
How far away is it?
It's the research is there, the evidence is there, but to get it from the lab bench to the shop floor or the doctor's clinic is probably not going to happen for my generation, but maybe for some of you younger people eventually happen. And innovation I found out as I was doing my research is there actually is the technology that exists now to have a smart tampon that can literally collect that tissue at source and send information to an app on your phone, which your doctor could then download and go, oh, looks like, Lee's tampon is telling me this month. Maybe I should bring her in for a consultation and we'll arrange follow-up. So the research is there, the technology is catching up, but to get all this stuff and approval and and governments and funding bodies have to actually think these things are worthwhile. Always the case.
Yeah. About things like endometriosis soon. I want to circle back because sometimes I read a book, especially one of yours, and it tells me something I think I always knew it, but I never thought about it. Does that make any sense? So you talk about the fact that a baby is born from the womb, and we tend to ignore that because we so associate wombs with reproduction, with menstruation, with all things that grown-ups do or older people do. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about it and also what a baby's womb is doing? It's doing its own biological thing.
Yeah. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, I'm sure you'll all buy one tonight. The book is loosely structured around the actual life cycle of the uterus from birth to death. So we have to start with like, what is a baby womb doing? You know, and we don't like to think about that very much. We really don't think about it very much. Although, you know, a lot of people, if they go to maybe an ultrasound scan during pregnancy and they see little boy bits, they're more than happy to talk about that. And they go, oh, look, it's like his daddy, look at that, you know. But we don't like to. Girls' reproductive organ is too sexual, right? It's just gross, it's unseemly, it makes us feel uncomfortable. But you know, female infants aren't doing anything sexual, they're just existing in the same way that baby boys are. So we definitely should look at what, you know, the neonatal uterus is doing, and it's actually doing quite a two girls, but also as a midwife. Quite often on the postnatal ward, a parent would come to me with their baby girl's nappy and say, you know, look, there's blood in the nappy, and they'd be really distressed, understandably, because they didn't know what was happening. But actually, the baby girl's womb is really busy, because what happens is when the little girl is in her mum's uterus, she's getting some of mum's pregnancy hormones, and the little baby womb lining is thickening as it's being affected by mum's progesterone. But when the baby girl is born, she's no longer exposed to mum's hormones. And so the little baby uterus has basically like a withdrawal bleed. It's like a little tiny mini baby period. It's called pseudomenses. And it's nothing gross. It's nothing to be distressed by or weirded out about. It is completely normal and healthy. But because we don't ever talk about these things and we don't like to think about these things, of course panic and we think something's wrong. So we have to, you know, normalize the functions of the womb really from birth to death, because it's just there, it's just existing the same way as your heart is beating, your liver is doing things, your kidneys are doing things, and it's not fair to sexualize it, because we're diminishing, you know, just normal function.
So for many, many years, there was prevalent, I want to quote, wisdom that a person with a uterus was prone to hysteria, and that all their moods were governed by this mad, loose cannon organ inside them, which all those problems could probably be solved by penetration. Now, this is bullshit. Having said that,
Yeah.
there is a womb-brain relationship. You
Yeah.
talk about it, it's fascinating. And you talk about research, in particular by a woman called Dr. Sarah Hill and others. Can you talk to us about this relationship, which is not hysteria?
Yeah.
Not that I'm hysterical.
Terrible. No, it is. So initially, going way back thousands of years, our sort of Western medical tradition, and actually, in fact, our general social ideas about women were influenced by Greek and Roman philosophers and medics who were men. They got to write the historical record. Their thoughts and ideas are basically what we're left with. And they believed, as one of them put it, that a woman's body is a temple built over a sewer. So woman has this beautiful body, and then this horrible, filthy stuff going on down below that kind of ruins it for everyone. And even worse than that, there was this idea that the womb was this sort of wily, mischievous, mysterious creature that could migrate around the body, the wandering womb. And the more this womb wandered around your body, the more havoc it would wreak on your behavior. And the cure for this, yes, as many philosophers and even doctors thought over the years, was supposed to be penetrative sex and or sperm, ideally both. So we know now, fortunately, that's not true. And it's important to be careful when we talk about the womb-brain connection, because we don't want to be reductive. We don't want to go back to this notion that, oh, actually, sorry, ladies, like your brain is actually controlled by the womb. That's not the case. But what we know now is that there is some relationship, and it is a lot more nuanced than maybe what we thought. There's really interesting research. I talk about this study in the book that, at least in animal studies, animals who've had hysterectomy, so the uterus removed, performed more poorly on cognitive and spatial tasks than the sort of control group who had their wombs. And there were no other confounding factors apart from the fact that these rats in this case had their uterus removed. And anecdotally, because fortunately science hasn't studied this in great depth, but anecdotally, a lot of women do report cognitive and mood changes after hysterectomy, some positive and some negative. So we don't fully understand what the connection is, but we think it is probably there. And it can be further confounded by hormones. So many of us throughout our seasons of our reproductive lives use hormonal contraception to manage family planning and avoid pregnancy for whatever reason. And those hormones often act directly on the uterus. And we know that those hormones also act directly on the brain in its many ways and can influence mood and cognition and even some personality traits. So it is all connected and it's quite complicated, and we owe the womb the chance to look at this in greater depth and to understand it without going back to this reductive idea that we're controlled by it. Yeah.
Of course not.
Yeah.
The other thing we're often taught is that the uterus, the whole female reproduction, we're just hanging around waiting for that joyous sperm to arrive when it's time to have a baby. But in fact, the uterus is being really proactive in this quest. Can you talk about what it does to make conception, not contraception, happen?
Yes. So again, similar to the sterile womb paradigm, this is another idea that a lot of us have been kind of raised with since our earliest years. We're raised with this macho myth that in conception, the male, so the male body and the sperm itself, is the active partner and the female body is passive. So we're taught to think of this questing sperm, making its brave journey, really hard, waggling its tail, which it does do. But we're really taught to be like super impressed with how this sperm travels up this treacherous vagina and makes it through the cervix and up into the womb. And that the womb is just kind of like, again, just hanging out, not doing much, just passively waiting for this amazing heroic sperm to fertilize an egg. And what we actually know is that what some scientists are calling the little finesse, the upsuck theory, which is that the lining of the uterus has what we call a peristaltic motion, so a tiny sort of wave-like motion that, especially when orgasm happens, can actually draw the sperm deeper into the uterus and facilitate conception. So it's actively encouraging conception rather than just kind of hanging out waiting for it to happen. And there's also fascinating research from the 1960s, which hasn't really been picked up and sort of run with since then, that the neck of the womb, the cervix, actually has little crypts in it or pockets, which can store sperm until such time as ovulation occurs and it's sort of maximal time for conception. So the uterus itself actually has not just one, but probably several mechanisms of aiding conception and encouraging conception to happen, and is far from this passive, empty vessel that we were told it was. Yeah.
I'm going to skip over gestation temporarily because you wrote an entire book about it, which I also encourage people to read. Can we talk instead about some of the ways that things can go wrong?
Yeah.
We talk at length about fibroids and endometriosis and cancer. And they all sound horrific.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a bit about each of them?
Sure. I mean, while the book ultimately aims to celebrate the uterus, it's important to be really honest and frank about not just the functions, but the dysfunctions, because many people with wombs are affected by endometriosis, which is where the tissue similar to the lining of the womb exists in other parts of the body and cause pain, bleeding, fatigue, and really debilitating symptoms. And we've got things like fibroids, which are benign tumors that grow within the uterus, but again can cause really debilitating pain, heavy bleeding, problems with conception and pregnancy, adenomyosis, where you can get sort of the lining of the womb growing into the muscle wall of the womb, again, pain. Of people with wounds who are suffering from these conditions. And I've had a wound for 45 years and here with me now tonight. And I've had a checkered gynecological career, so many of us have, and I have to spend probably a good 2 weeks of every month thinking about what my uterus is going to do, how it might behave, what I might need, can I work on this day, can I not work, how am I going to feel? And a lot of us, for whatever reason, are the same. But although science is moving ahead with sort of managing these conditions, it's not where it should be, and we need to be frank and open about that.
How much of that is due to the fact that so much of medicine is based on the fact that the male is the clear, obvious human model, and the woman is this sort of other?
Yeah.
And possibly flawed other.
Yeah, well, the male model still is very much the default when we think about things, for example, like drug testing. And a recent example of that is COVID vaccine, which, by the way, I'm all in favor of, but what really sort of hindered, I think, the public sort of adoption of the vaccine at the beginning, and probably still, is that it took a long time for drug companies to realize that the vaccine could be tested not just on people with wounds, but people with pregnant wombs, and that also it was important to look at the effect of the vaccine on the uterus in terms of menstrual disruption, how it affects receptors in the ovaries, how it affects perimenopausal and menopausal women, people on HRT. So that's just one example of how the male model is very much the default, and we're still catching up with the ways that this intervention affects the uterus and people with wombs. And again, we can't progress, we can't improve diagnostic techniques and treatments unless we include women or people with wombs on a par with that male default.
Which leads me directly to the language.
Yeah.
The misogyny, and it's just, my blood was boiling reading the book. There are phrases like an irritable uterus, an incompetent cervix, the living decay of menopause. The idea that we have to make everybody feel this way, whether it's going to the gym or you're doing crutches or everybody feels they have to make their body behave. I get that. It's not just something that wounds, this notion that half the population has to be even more changed and more language.
Yeah, I mean, it's bad enough that people with wombs have to go through things like, struggling to conceive or pregnancy loss, miscarriage, stillbirth. But what makes it worse is that we beat women with this stick of abusive, negative language when it happens. So, when somebody has a really long is a subjective term, but a long labor, they're told they failed to progress, or your contractions were incoordinate, or if you have to lose a baby halfway through your pregnancy, you're told you had an incompetent cervix or cervical weakness. If you can't conceive, some women are told you have a hostile uterus. And this is really judgmental, negative language. And not only is it judgmental, but it's judgmental in a way that we would never apply to men. So I always use the example of, we talk about erectile dysfunction in men. We don't say you have a weak penis or you have a sad erection. We call it what it is, which is it's erectile dysfunction. It's a process that's not working. But for women, but how ludicrous we think it would be to apply this language to men, whereas we just accept that we tar women with these brushes and use these labels.
You never call it enlarged
prostate.
Yeah.
Somebody said to me, you have an incompetent cervix, I'd be like, oh wow, okay, that's
to be educated.
That's my fault. Yeah. And women do really feel like that. So in the book, there's a story of actually a fellow midwife who very sadly lost her twins at, I think it was 21, 22 weeks. And it was just a case of the cervix, the neck of the womb opened too much too soon, and sadly she lost her baby boys. And as if that wasn't awful enough for her to try and manage and comprehend, as if she didn't already blame herself enough for that, she was told, you have an incompetent cervix, not with any malice, but just because that's the language that, you know, medics use. And she spoke to me about how that really compounded the hurt and the shame that she felt. And I'm sure probably many of us in this room have been on the receiving end of this language, and maybe you didn't even think anything about it, but we really should question it and challenge it.
But you also make the point that by using those phrases, we forget to look at the environment or medical interventions that may have led to the problem.
Exactly. So, for example, we have this term irritable uterus, which is used to mean, you know, for some reason it's in pregnancy, a womb that's too, you know, painful all the time, seems to be contracting, but nothing's happening. And as a midwife, I've heard this term used countless times. I've probably used it myself, and I thought, okay, you know, doctors are using this term all the time. This is obviously legit. But it wasn't until I started researching it for the book that I found the term actually isn't a, you know, disease or state that's recognized by the World Health Organization. It appears nowhere in the academic literature online. It's not actually, doesn't actually describe anything with any accuracy. And it was first used in the 18th century by a pretty time nutrition to describe pain like parties, or miscarried, or suffered bereavement. And the term irritable uterus was developed to describe the, you know, physical symptoms that these poor women were experiencing. And now, in the year 2023, you can definitely maternity triage department or an NHS hospital and be told you have an irritable uterus, when in fact there's no basis in evidence whatsoever. So that was pretty confronting for me. As were other things I discovered in the book about, we were talking about the history of induction of labor and cesarean section, and these are all very common interventions.
You talk about 3 interventions that the numbers seem to go up and up and up: hysterectomy, induction of labor, and cesarean.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when I was a little kid being told that my grandmother had had a hysterectomy, and there was never any explanation to why, and I never questioned it. But it was a thing, especially, I don't know if here in America, they seem to just yank them out willy-nilly, you know.
Yeah.
Despite it, you know, it's misbehaving the tiniest bit, let's just remove it. And that has ramifications.
It does have ramifications, and you know, I should point out to me an induction and cesarean and can be very therapeutic. So I'm not by any means coming at this from, you know, all interventions are bad at all. But I do think it's appropriate routinely and on a regular basis question how we're continuing to use certain interventions, why we're using them, and why maybe some of them are becoming so prevalent. So hysterectomy is one of the most commonly performed in the UK. And I found an interesting statistic from America that, I forget the exact number because I forget what you write in your own book. But there was a huge number of hysterectomies in America that when you actually looked back at what they found when they took the womb out, you know, after the fact, the medics realized that the condition of the uterus didn't support the initial diagnosis that led to the hysterectomy. So in essence, it was not needed. So that's major surgery, removal of a major organ for actually, in hindsight, no reason. And in terms of inductions and cesarean section, so actually just yesterday I was looking at the stats for my own hospital, which shall remain nameless, where I still work, for the year ending November 2022, and just over 40% of labours were induced. So we were getting the uterus to do something that it wasn't quite ready to do itself for whatever reason. And just nearly 40% of all births were cesarean section, were surgical birth. And again, I'm not saying, you know, it's all terrible and cesarean sections are bad and induced labours are always unnecessary, but it's important to question and interrogate why are we more and more and more treating the uterus as a defective organ that needs to be saved, needs to be cut, needs to be accelerated? Why are we treating it as, you know, something that's flawed and faulty that we can somehow fix? Because these interventions are not without consequences. So
I was especially curious about the induction consequences. There were, you talked about a few things, both for the mother and the baby, that startled me. Can you explain what they are? And again, couched in the fact that sometimes
can be very life-saving and, you know, absolutely are necessary. So induction of labor, you know, people have been trying to accelerate labor since, you know, as long as people have been going into labor. And for much of history, that process was managed by midwives or just, you know, lay people, lay women who were assisting with birth. And they had their own, quite often herbal or botanical ways of making that happen. That, of course, weren't always perfect, didn't always work, but they were, you know, used over generations. And then men got a hold of them, using them in ways that the original birth attendants had never intended. And these medications and botanical substances could make women give birth very, very quickly, which was very handy with doctors because then they had to only spend a very brief time at the bedside. And this process made leaps and bounds forward in the 1950s when oxytocin, which is the hormone that actually brings on contractions naturally, was synthesized in a lab for the first time. So think back to 1950s, think space age, Sputnik, progress, advances, right? Well, it was the same in obstetrics. Doctors looked at this new synthesized substance and thought, wow, like to the moon, you know, we can make labor happen anytime we want, as fast as we want. And it literally, this substance was marketed with very space age imagery and touted as being really progressive and, you know, will really fix all those women in their wombs that just don't behave the way we want them to. And so synthetic oxytocin, which we still use now for induction of labor, was really adapted worldwide at remarkable speed. And now, fast forward to now, is used to initiate or augment 40% of labors. And, you know, actually most what I found while researching the book was that in many cases, the regime, so the dosage used to administer this medication is completely off-label and it's actually completely different from what the manufacturers advise and recommend. And not only are staff not aware of this, I'll put my hand up to that, but of course, women and people who give birth are not made aware of this either. So informed consent goes out the window. And I spoke to two very interesting and wily retired midwives who had identified in their own practice that these increasing rates of induction of labor and use of off-label oxytocin were massive rates of postpartum hemorrhage and other postnatal complications. And they tried to rattle a few cages with statutory organisations around the UK who sort of control obstetrics and gynecology and were basically stonewalled and didn't really make much headway with it. But going back to your point, it's just another example of the way that techniques to sort of manage and modulate and control the womb have been really wholesale adapted without oftentimes the questioning that would make these practices safer.
Circling back to hysterectomy, there's also the thorny issue of eugenics at play.
Yes, very much so. And
forced sterilization.
Forced sterilization.
Same envelope.
Yeah. So again, sort of the dark side of using the womb as a sort of tool of control, political control, and ideology is that you know, fertility has been used and control of fertility has been used as a weapon of war since time immemorial. And more recently, for example, in World War II, in the Holocaust, the Nazis notoriously performed hysterectomies on many, many women in concentration camps, and there were highly coordinated programs to use hysterectomy to humiliate and ultimately exterminate the people who were imprisoned and ultimately killed by the Nazis. And there were American politicians who were actually watching this with some admiration and thinking, well, interesting, we could use these reproductive techniques to maybe get rid of some of the less desirable elements of our population. And there was a major case in America called Buck versus Bell, where a young woman who had actually been raped by a neighbor was sterilized because she was deemed to be intellectually deficient. And the Supreme Court case basically legitimized that kind of reproductive control in America. And since then was used as the rationale for potentially tens of thousands of forced and coercive sterilizations in state institutions, prisons, immigration centers, until and probably still quite recently. And as somebody who was born and raised in America and only left in 1999, a lot of that was a surprise to me as well, because I don't know about you, but we didn't learn about that side of our history in high school.
I knew a bit about the, I'm older than you, so civil rights was going on when I was in elementary school, and so there was a lot of that in the zeitgeist. Not suggesting I was completely up to speed on things as a kid, but yeah, I had that sense that it was being weaponized.
Yeah, and this is ultimately, so this is sort of the serious point at the end of the book. We start with some kind of quirky facts about the womb, but what I'm really sort of getting to in the whole arc of the book is how the womb really is a huge symbol and tool of power, not only for people who have one, but for the people who wish to control those people. And so, yes, I've written a book about the uterus, and there are lots of quirky and cool and funky facts about what it can do and what it can't do. But ultimately, we need to look at how, as a society, we view this organ, how we legislate it, how we medicate it, how we manage it. Because only when we really understand and respect the womb can we call ourselves a fair and just society, because reproductive rights are human rights. Yeah.
Well, last question before I turn it over to the audience. We say that, but one of the things you talk about is the possibility that the womb as we know it, I'm pointing to mine in there somewhere, because I brought mine as well, might become redundant because they're looking at making a synthetic womb. So you could sort of, carry your fetus in a little bag.
Mm-hmm. Potentially, it's not entirely out with the realm of possibility.
That was a bad explanation. We didn't have a good
no, I mean, some of us may have read Brave New World, which has been many years ago, and features this kind of futuristic world where babies are gestated in jars on shelves, and this is deemed in the book to be progress. This is wonderful because it frees women of the burden of reproduction. And many of us who've had babies might think, yeah, I could go for a bit of that. But the technology is actually moving towards being able to create these synthetic uteruses. A few years ago, there was a famous picture of a lamb in a bio bag, which had been created by scientists in Philadelphia and brought to full gestation within this synthetic environment. And we've been able to do it with mice to a certain point, and it's not entirely impossible that we may be able to create a synthetic environment in which fetuses can be gestated, maybe not fully, but possibly for a partial gestation. And although this may represent an enormous freedom for some people, because then you can go about your business while your baby is, in your bag at your side or in the jar on the shelf, we also have to be really careful, because possibly people will start to think, well, women's bodies are quite dangerous and quite unpredictable and fraught, and women's behavior is quite weird and dangerous at times. So maybe it's safer that we just force women to have, surrender their fetuses and gestate them in these mechanical wombs. And, possibly, let's say you're pregnant and tell your midwife at 22 weeks, yeah, I actually had a glass of wine last week, and I wasn't supposed to, but that was good. And the midwife might go, well, I might just mention that to the doctor, and they might just put you down on the list as maybe a candidate where your baby would be better off in this safer, more controlled environment.
There's Margaret Atwood.
Yeah, very Margaret Atwood. So every technology is a double-edged sword, and it's interesting to think about the future and how some of these technologies could be liberating, but also in the wrong context, in the wrong hands, could be quite oppressive as well.
Terrifying, in a way.
Yeah.
It's terrifying in a way.
Yeah.
You must have questions. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I know the online audience may well have questions, and those questions will be shouted out.
Yeah.
Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so there are two to start with online. The first one is from Harriet, who's down as Midwife Harriet. As a midwife, do you balance practicing now you have written this book? How do you balance practicing now that you have written this book, but also still live within trust nice guidelines? Has it changed how you practice, specifically referencing induction of labor?
Spoken like a true midwife. Hello, Harriet. Yeah, how do I balance? Very carefully. So I do still work in the NHS, not nearly as much as I used to. I kind of do the odd shift now rather than regular shift, because life and because NHS. But it's interesting. I work in a, probably a typical, high risk obstetric-led, very interventionist, big urban NHS hospital. I very much am a cog in the machine when I go to work, and I accept that. I may not like it, but I accept it. I would like to keep my job. And so, yeah, I very much have to operate within the protocols and guidelines that exist in my unit. That's not to say that I don't try and have lengthy conversations when I can to make sure that people in my care can give them, fully informed choice and decisions about any interventions and care they receive. But it's hard, it's not always possible. And yeah, definitely certain things I came across in the book were quite confronting and did make me reflect on my own practice, and question a lot of what I have to do. But I have my author hat, and then unfortunately, yeah, I have my NHS cog in the wheel hat, and I would like to keep my job, so I have to work within the confines of that job.
Is there one in the room? A question?
There's one
Yeah,
right
yeah.
here in the front.
Yeah. Hello. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked the question. So the question was, do I address race in the book, specifically in the maternity context, but maybe in a broader context as well? And absolutely. So race and medical bias and medical racism and all of that entails is a constant theme through the book. There isn't just one chapter about, if you're a person of color, this happens to you, because basically the gist of the book is that if you're a person of color, and basically anything a white person experiences, unfortunately, you're probably experiencing worse, and being managed in a possibly less sympathetic way by the medical profession that you have to encounter. So that theme runs through chapters in the book about a woman who's trying to manage her endometriosis, and women who experience interventions in labor, absolutely forced and coercive sterilization, and reproductive rights in terms of issues around abortion. So yeah, as it relates to maternity, you mentioned the EMBRACE study, which maybe not everybody will know, is a regular audit of maternal morbidity and mortality. And the most recent EMBRACE study shows that Black women in the UK have roughly a 4-time higher chance of dying in the perinatal period as their white cohorts. And I think Asian women, it's maybe 2 to 3 times. Don't quote me on that, I'd have to look it up, but it's certainly, multiple times more than white women going through the system. So just as maternity is quite often a reflection of what's going on in wider society, unfortunately, race plays a huge issue in, broader gynae and reproductive health as well, and that's absolutely in the book. Yeah.
There was one question back here, and then there's one online. So yeah.
Shout out. Yeah.
wondering about like further research, like rights, and how that might affect everyone. I know that like some of the moment are very late about women not wanting like period trackers, if they're worried about status. I'm wondering how you think that might have that knowing more about that.
Yeah, very interesting. So there is a big section in the book actually about period trackers and femtech, which is a term I kind of hate a little bit, although I understand why it exists. And how some people are using this technology in a way that's really empowering, that's helping them either to conceive or to avoid pregnancy or to manage symptoms around menstruation. But the companies that are behind these technologies and these apps are not always using that data in the most savory way, or a way that the consumer always understands. So there's been some huge lawsuits, specifically in America, against certain period tracking apps because of massive data breaches and not being open with consumers about the way that their information is being shared. And especially now, with the rollback of Roe v. Wade, rightly, consumers are nervous that, you know, when you enter in, oh, I haven't had a period for 8 weeks, that somebody somewhere in the cloud might be looking at that going, huh, you know, and they might then be tracking your fertility or pregnancy or lack thereof. And I think these are really legitimate questions, because already the dystopian themes we're seeing in America are far beyond anything that we probably would have imagined a couple of years ago. So it's totally reasonable to think that technology will play a part in that. So I spoke to a woman who was the founder of Clue, one of the world's biggest period tracking apps. And she has quite an optimistic, almost idealistic view of the way her company would use consumers' data, in the sense that consumers would be encouraged to track all kinds of reproductive symptoms and experiences, so that ultimately they could generate a kind of bird's eye report of their entire gynae health, which they could then bring to, for example, a GP, who could then look at that and analyze it very easily and understand what was going on with that individual. But what she accepted, and I agreed with in her interview, is that some of her colleagues are absolutely not in it for those reasons. So it's certainly, again, in technology, that's a double-edged sword. Yeah.
With another one online, and then we'll get to someone else in the room, from Leah. From a medical and or a political perspective, what would be the 3 most urgent issues that need addressing to really liberate or empower folks with wombs?
Wow. Okay. Okay. So from any perspective, I guess, what are the 3 most pressing issues that need to be resolved or improved for people with wombs? I would say the most pressing issue probably is around abortion rights, because abortion is healthcare. Women have been seeking abortion and terminating pregnancies for whatever reason for as long as the historical record can record, and they will continue to do so in ways that are safe or unsafe, regardless of what their local government permits. So it's not just an American issue. Obviously, there are things happening on an almost daily basis to roll back abortion rights in America. But for example, in Scotland, we have this current issue of anti-choice protesters around premises where abortion care is provided, and efforts to push buffer zone legislation through Scottish Parliament to allow people to access abortion unhindered by intimidation and harassment. So I think around the world, to greater or lesser degree, abortion is probably, maybe number 1 issue. I think that fertility and miscarriage and pregnancy loss are vastly under-researched and poorly understood, even in this day and age, although there are advances, maybe not happening as quickly as it should. And I think actually, this issue of periods, not only dysfunctional and painful and heavy bleeding, but also what periods can tell us, what they can teach us about our health. So I would probably rank those, maybe not necessarily in that order, or maybe, but I would put those as the top 3 in my mind.
Anybody else in the room have a question?
Anything else?
Oh,
Yeah, one more at the front. Yeah. So you're asking like, can we improve or change our uterine microbiome the way that we would take yogurt or something? Yeah, great question. We don't really know yet. We know that there is a correlation between obesity, uterine microbiome, and uterine cancers, which is very interesting. So that research is actually pretty solid now, and more is emerging all the time. But we don't fully understand how you could modify or whether you could modify your uterine microbiome to change the course of that disease progression.
I'm just thinking, I'm just old enough that I remember back in the day, if something was going wrong down there, doctors tell you to shove yogurt up your jacksie.
Yeah, and not without, cause completely. So that would be for your vaginal microbiome.
Okay, sorry.
So it's adjacent and it's a legitimate question. Some people would still do that. So we have known for quite a while that the vagina does have its own microbiome, and it will have good and bad bacteria in there all the time. And when that balance gets disrupted, you can get things like yeast infections, and that's just, it happens. But the uterine microbiome is separate, and what we're finding is, although there are some organisms in common between the two, they seem to have a very, actually quite different profile. So yeah, we don't fully understand yet how you could maybe alter your microbiome in your womb, or why you would want to, or should you even try. But I imagine that will become clear over in the fullness of time. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Of reproduction and food.
Mhm.
And I say this as a woman who has had 4 years on the
Yeah. So the question, or the sentiment is that, is it just madness to think of a future where we could grow babies in jars and make it into a kind of clinical process? And yes, in a sense, it does evoke kind of a visceral response, I think, in a lot of us, that, like, that's just wrong, just taking all the heat and the mess and the warmth and the humanity away from that process. But to play devil's advocate, one can maybe imagine, for people who really struggle to carry a pregnancy to term for whatever reason, maybe for men and non-binary people who want to be able to have a pregnancy but can't do it in their own body, and maybe for people who, for better for worse, for financial or professional reasons, don't wish to have that burden for 9 months. One could maybe see how there would be people for whom this would be an appealing process. One could also see how there are people for whom it would be repugnant. But it's interesting, when we look back at other advances in fertility and gynecology, let's say, for example, IVF, that evoked a response of real horror from a lot of people at the time when it first kind of came to light in the public, and a lot of people saying this is unnatural, you're playing God, some people just weren't meant to be pregnant. Some people still feel that way. So I'm not saying at all that's how I feel or what I believe, but it's important to look back and understand that actually for most major, biomedical advances, there have been real differences of opinion as to whether it's progress or dangerous.
There is a person alive who still is called the test tube baby.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, Louise Brown. And a lot of people, when she was born, thought this is truly repugnant, and this is ethically wrong. And it's an interesting issue. We were writing the book about uterus transplants and the use of deceased organ donors. We quite happily, well, not happily, but we generally expect that when someone dies, if they signed up to be an organ donor, we might use their heart or their lungs or cornea or whatever. But for many people, the idea of using a deceased person's womb and then transplanting that into somebody else and growing a baby in that womb, many people find that really, really difficult to get their heads around. So one person's progress is another person's danger. It's very interesting.
You've got another.
Yeah, there's another one online.
Okay, we'll have to make this, it's almost 8 o'clock, so we'll make that the last question.
This one's from Paul. Did you discover any interesting or surprising research around endometriosis? It seems ever more common in my cohort of friends, and it's awful.
Yeah, okay, well, thanks, Paul, for that question. It's interesting. A lot of people probably do feel like, oh, endometriosis is everywhere now, everyone's got it. And I think probably what's happening is it's not necessarily more people have it, but we're maybe more aware of the symptoms. More people are presenting to their doctors and kind of seeking diagnosis or treatment, which is a good thing, you know, essentially, that we no longer just think, oh, she's hysterical, or, you know, she's just got bad periods or whatever. But are there broader reasons? Is there something in the water? Is there something going on in society that more people are suffering from these conditions? I don't know, but we do have interesting research, like that trial I was talking about that analyzes menstrual blood for signs of endometriosis. That, you know, these kinds of studies do hold promise, and hopefully science will catch up with this growing body of people who are presenting with symptoms.
Well, I'm pretty sure that Leah will be very happy to sign anybody's book, should you wish that to happen after you've purchased it. And so before we break up, can we say thank you?